My name is Emily, and at 20 years old, my family raised me to marry my cousin at 18 to preserve our bloodline. Then I escaped, testified, and watched the FBI raid our house. If you have ever felt betrayed by the people who should have been your biggest supporters, let me know where you are watching from. My parents told me I'd marry my cousin Adrienne Voss the day after graduation at 18 to preserve our superior bloodline through planned breeding. My mother, Margaret Voss, came from a wealthy Southern family that lived like the Civil War never ended and believed they had leadership DNA. Father, geneticist Dr. Heinrich Voss, was fired from 3 colleges for his racial views, but continued his research in our basement lab. They collected family DNA and made breeding charts for our dining room walls when I was young. It was calculated that Adrienne and I have the most founding stock genetics. He'd drive me and tell me how glad he was to have me as his breeding partner, and how many children we'd have. 5 minimum, he'd say while massaging my shoulder. Maybe 7 if your hips grew properly. My parents accepted these sessions and left us alone in the house for hours, despite my discomfort. Mom dressed me up and told me to be sweet to my future husband before he arrived. They sent the dates to other genetic reservation families after choosing our family's historic property for the wedding. They prepared me for breeding at 18. Mom took me to reproductive systems specialist Dr. Anton Kruger for childbearing approval. The doctor was no longer licensed, but my parents believed him because he shared their views on racial purity and genetic supremacy. The doctor gave my parents fertility tablets and a breeding calendar with my most fertile days. Adrienne began visiting frequently and discussing our future children's genetics at family dinners. He stated, "Our firstborn will have the perfect Nordic features," as my parents grinned. "Selective breeding will revive this family." I tried telling teachers, but my parents believed I was mentally disturbed and lied for attention. Because they provided so much to the school, administrators didn't investigate. I begged my older brother, Julian Voss, for help, but he shrugged and said he married his second cousin 8 years before. Why the fuss? All the family did this dreadful thing and treated me like a marketable cow. Mom homeschooled my senior year to control me and prevent outside influence. She made me read genetic superiority books and quiz me on 11-generation bloodlines. I contemplated impossible escapes out my bedroom window for hours, suffering from loneliness. While searching for escape money, I uncovered my grandma Beatrix Voss's diary in the attic, changing my life. She documented decades of forced marriages and rejected females, corrected, preventing them from having children. A weird accident killed another cousin who loved someone outside the permissible genetic pool 3 weeks before her forced wedding. Names, dates, and photographs of wounded girls who resisted were in the diary. While helping others escape, my granny was caught and electroshocked until she lost their identities. Last entry cautioned ladies who found this. They will kill you before infecting lineage. Each page revealed more horror about my family's breeding scheme and wicked past. I reached one of the escaping cousins, Ingrid Voss, using a diary code and learned of an underground network that helped our family girls. She thought 9 years of masking her identity were worth being observed. Adrienne's next visit, as my parents were preparing for the wedding, she took me up. The simple method, which needed precise timing, took days to memorize. They found the diary and escape plan. Adrienne arrived that day with others. Medical equipment and his 2 relatives froze my blood. Dad stated the wedding was moved to tonight because I was unstable. Mom locked the doors. Dad removed leather handcuffs from a medical bag and said, "We'll do the ceremony first." Adrienne smiled at me as he prepared a syringe for an IV drip. "Don't worry, cousin," he whispered. "The sedatives will make you more cooperative for breeding." 4 males blocked every exit as I backed against the wall. Mom held me when Adrienne inserted the needle. He said, "Just a little prick, and then you'll be mine forever." I kneeled on Adrienne's groin before my thoughts could catch up. He dropped the syringe and collapsed, moaning as I escaped Mom and grabbed the diary. Dad charged me, but I dodged his arms and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Mom shouted for my cousins to save me as Adrienne groaned on the floor. As footsteps rose, I shut the upstairs bathroom door and wedged a chair under the latch. Dad ordered someone to get his garage tools as their weight rocked the door. My palms shook as I typed Elena Weiss's emergency number with our agreed-upon message on my phone. My practice run split the bathroom window, so I pushed it wide. I squeezed through the window frame and, while Dad worked on the door hinges, dropped onto the garage roof after climbing the toilet and sink counter. Despite injuring my ankle, I leaped off the garden shed roof. The bathroom door broke above me, and Adrian shouted that I was in the garden. After years of solo exploration, I ran toward the treeing, knowing every path and hiding location. I followed the creek track into the dark woods because I knew it. Elena said she'd be at the old bridge in 6 minutes on my phone as flashlight lights cut through the darkness behind me. I knew this was my only opportunity, but each step tortured my 3 aunts who tried to run away but were caught and twisted ankle. Seeing the bridge without a car was alarming. Dad's truck's headlights appeared after branches cracked, not Elena's gray Honda. As he slowly drove past, lighting the trees, I held my breath behind the concrete bridge support. Adrian was directing the search pattern on his CB radio and telling someone to investigate the gas station down the road. I froze for another minute until spotting headlights from the other direction. After the vehicle passed, Elena's gray Honda pulled up and I hurried from my hiding place, leaping in through the back door. Before I secured the door, she gasped and we passed Dad's truck, returning to the bridge. As our automobiles passed within feet, I lay flat in the back seat, frightened to breathe. Elena drove steadily for 10 minutes before letting me sit up. When we stopped at a truck stop 3 hours later, I shut myself in a toilet stall to read Grandmother Beatrice's diary again. Although the safe house sheets were moist, I read 4 states' addresses. Elena gently knocked, suggesting we relocate, and I recalled I left my phone in her car. Despite my ankle swelling in my shoe and severe leg discomfort, I followed her back to the Honda. As the mountains disappeared, she drove into the darkness, discussing network rules. She said, "No contact with anyone from our past for 6 months minimum while they build a legal case. The safe residence will contain fresh IDs and a similar case lawyer. They knew how to hide us and have helped many girls escape households like mine." As the familiar countryside faded, I realized I would never return. Elena called. While I ate scrambled eggs at a diner 3 states away the next morning. TV over the counter aired local news without mentioning a missing girl. I wondered if my family phoned the police or handled things internally, as Grandmother's diary suggested. Elena answered network calls outside because her phone rang often. She returned with a tense look and stated they were starting emergency protocols. My family had police ties in other states, and the network caught roadblock discussion. Changing cars and taking a safer route was important. Why preserve so many records if the family is wrong? Their atrocities are chronicled in the grandmother's journals, wall breeding charts, and DNA samples. The network was busy protecting 4 other girls who escaped similar situations this year. Elena paid the bill, and we found a blue car with the keys under the carpet in the parking lot. Elena claimed 6 years of freedom as a survivor. Woman who left it left. We left the Honda for someone to pick up after relocating my luggage and diary to the new car. As we drove away, I imagined those other females fleeing Adrian and their families' breeding programs. Rich families with perverse beliefs coerced young girls into genetic reservation schemes more often than anyone wanted to admit, creating the network. Elena took girls from religious compounds and privileged houses like mine. We ran from breeders. 2 hours later, Elena stopped at a rest stop and a state trooper's cruiser near the entrance made me sick. Police officers stood beside their cars using their phones and watching passing cars. Elena saw him too and flinched, but she drove leisurely toward the parking slots. Stopping far from the trooper, she wrote swiftly on her phone with her head down. We departed walking normally despite my weak legs when she stated, "Bathroom." Elena grabbed my arm and held me as the trooper approached Elena's car. In the women's room, she led me beyond the stalls to a maintenance-only door she opened without stopping. Elena pushed me toward a minivan key-holding woman while glancing at the front door. Greta Lindholm started the van as we sprinted across the back lot. Greta drove slowly as Elena stared behind us, relaxing after 10 minutes. Greta left her family 22 years ago when they tried to make her marry her uncle. She said her parents reported Elena as a cult member who kidnapped females. The news dubbed me a brainwashed victim, and my parents sobbed over their daughter on every channel. These families often presented escapees as insane, so no one believed us. I was in a little apartment 4 days later, trying to recall my new name. Emily Morrow, the network's lawyer, who wouldn't reveal her name, gave me a stack of paper and told me to write everything. She advised me to jot down the breeding program details while they were fresh in my mind. I kept writing about Adrian, supplements, and doctor appointments. After 20 pages, even though my fingers cramped, the lawyer handed me my missing news on her laptop. Mom wiped her eyes, and Dad cried for my homecoming, recorded perfectly by the camera. They sympathized and branded me selfish and ungrateful for leaving wonderful parents. Nobody wondered why an 18-year-old would flee nice parents on TV. A critic said I was probably on drugs, and another said, kids today don't appreciate good families. The lawyer said this was usual for families like mine that controlled the story. Mom was hospitalized from stress, Julian claimed over the burner phone. He begged me to call to let them know I was alive since Mom might not. Elena grabbed the phone as I went for it and listened to Julian. He changed tone and said they could find me with or without help when I didn't respond. We packed within an hour after Elena hung up, since a burner may track the call. Greta took us to another safe home and told me her story in simple terms. Her relatives pressured her to procreate with her mother's brother at 15 to maintain their bloodline. Her 32-year-old daughter continued the tradition after she fled after giving birth. Numerous accounts of girls and women who escaped and failed were broadcast. 1 week after my escape, I was at my fourth safe place, unable to sleep since every sound made me jump. To remember why I ran, I checked the locks and read Grandmother Beatrix's diary. Isabel Voss returned for a basement wedding after 3 years in hiding. Her family sedated her for the wedding, and she had twins 9 months later before leaving. I wondered if Isabel was dead or locked in a family property with babies. The network doctor found a tiny ankle scar after I mentioned the vitamin shots. I don't remember surgery, but she said it looked surgical. The X-ray showed metal under the skin. The doctor went white when she discovered it was a tracking chip put during one of my checks. After removing it immediately, she noticed 2 chips nestled like Russian dolls. The first sent my location, but the second was inactive until she removed it. The monitor received a louder signal after a loud buzzer. The doctor predicted 30 minutes till help arrived, and the network went into emergency mode. I became cold seeing Dad's pickup at an intersection while Elena drove quickly to safety. 2 family were in the back, watching cars at the red light with Adrienne in the passenger seat. Elena hit a parking structure and the tires screamed as we climbed the hill. We ran toward the stairwell, echoing off the concrete walls after she stopped. Elena slowed me down as we hurried from the stairwell to the main floor to escape suspicion. The bus terminal was 3 streets away, yet every person we passed made my heart accelerate. Elena peered behind us as I pulled my hood up and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking. Mom called from a corner payphone while I waited for Dad's pickup. We sped toward the Greyhound sign after she hung up. I stayed close to Elena while she bought my ticket with cash at the crowded terminal with suitcases. My driver's license had my photo, but a different name and birthday, making me 21. Gate 12's departure indicator showed my bus leaving in 10 minutes. Elena walked me to the gate, then stared. "Remember the codes I taught you?" she continued. She grabbed my shoulder and ran to the parking lot. I spotted Elena enter a different car via the window while waiting behind an elderly woman with heavy luggage. The bus driver took my ticket without looking at me, and I sat in the back to watch everyone. I watched Elena's car travel north while my bus headed south, pressing my cheek against the cold pane. As more passengers boarded, I lowered my hood to look for familiar faces. My knapsack held Grandmother Beatrix's diary on my leg. After the bus left, I was alone for the first time since that basement night, 10 days into my escape. The highway loomed ahead, so I opened the journal to a marked page. I felt uneasy reading Isabel's description in Grandmother's shaky hand. After escaping in 1989, she worked at an Oregon cafe for 3 years before her brothers found her. Grandmother heard cellar moans for 3 weeks after pulling her back. Grandmother found bloody sheets on the fire pile when Isabel never returned. Grandmother's comment that Isabel was caught pregnant by a non-B bloodline ended the entry. I closed the diary and watched the miles, vowing not to become Isabel. My following bus at the Tennessee transfer station took 4 hours. I sat in a corner to monitor both entrances because the station was smaller than expected. I froze when my cousin Leon Voss questioned drivers near the ticket booth an hour in. He probably exhibited my photo and took their answers. My burner phone from Elena was in my hand when I silently entered the lavatory and sealed myself in. I mumbled when the network contact answered the second ring. I was told to buy a ticket the other direction, make 2 stops, and return tomorrow on a different route. After 20 minutes, I left without complaint. Leon remained at the ticket booth, but faced away from departure gates. I bought a Memphis ticket and boarded as Leon approached my gate. I watched him inspect the other bus's passengers through the window as my bus left. 4 days later, I reached the next safe home, a modest ranch with an American flag. Talk about unwelcome family reunions. I was tracked like a lost pet instead than a woman who refused to marry her cousin. The responding elderly couple wore matching sweaters and smiled like wonderful grandparents. The wife served me tea, while the father informed me they escaped breeding programs 45 years previously. I learned over pot roast that my family was part of a 14SD state genetic purity network of thousands. The woman showed me her arm scars from her family trying to breed her with her uncle at 15. They retired to save girls like us and saved 14. Driven to court the next morning to file an emergency protective order. As I recounted the forced marriage and breeding program, the judge nodded politely. His face changed when I presented the family names. Shuffling papers, he said there was no immediate threat. In his argument of the order, I saw Judge Alaric Fontaine, one of grandmother's related families, from her journals. He knew who I was and what I fled. I felt confined inside the safe house despite their goodwill. The old couple insisted I was safe 2 weeks after my escape. Yet it seemed wrong. I wanted water at 2 a.m. and heard kitchen voices. The phone man's voice made me creep down the passage and squeeze against the wall. "Yes, we have Emily," he muttered. "The real one. No runaways with that name. We'll gently bring her in tomorrow after she trusts us." My blood froze and I quietly went to my chamber. They were bounty hunters returning runaways, not network members. I grabbed my diary and backpack, opened the window, and left in pajamas, sprinting toward the street without looking back. Flashlights illuminated the yard as the rear door opened behind me. I ran harder as porch lights came on, hitting the pavement. I heard dogs barking and car doors banging at the home, and saw an unlocked car in a driveway. I threw open the door and dove into the back seat, covering myself with a forgotten jacket. The elderly couple and 3 men searched yards and garages with flashlights through the window. After they gave up, after 2 hours of searching, I hid until daylight because my feet were bleeding and I had no shoes. I escaped and walked to a library opening. The librarian barely noticed me as I headed to the rear computers. After entering Elena's codes on the network's emergency portal, I looked up the elderly couple's names and saw their images on the interceptor list. They caught runaways for 15 years as helpful grandparents, so they assumed I was caught after 3 days off the real network. Later, I read more of Grandmother Beatrix's diary about the decades-old false network in a study room. Some girls came home, but others disappeared. Families sponsored both real and fake escapes to catch runners. No one knew who was real anymore. Despite my family's gifts, Miss Anelia Hartman, my sophomore year counselor, was worried about me. She once asked whether everything was okay at home, but I was too scared to tell her. I dialed with a shaking palm, and her recognizable voice answered on the 3rd ring. "My God, is that you, Emily? Your classmates think you joined a cult. Your parents say you fled with a religious group." I exhaled carefully and told her everything. The sentences were fast, and I could hear her breathing alter. After a minute of silence, she said she was coming for me. I started to tell her it was hazardous, but she hung up with a car engine starting before the connection went dead. I barely recognized her with her black hair and new clothes when she arrived in a beat-up Honda at daybreak. After 2 hours, I noticed the black SUV always stayed 3 cars behind us in any lane. My heart raced for 3 weeks in that motel room while she drove 10 hours to her new teaching job. She looked in the mirror and turned her steering wheel knuckles white, but she calmly told me she'd been following my family since she saw bruises on my arms last year. She took photos and stored my essays about family life. Adrienne's face appeared in the glass as Ms. Hartman took the exit toward the police station without signaling. Adrienne followed us into the parking lot and got out of his car before we stopped. Inside the station, he played his worried cousin and told the desk sergeant I was mentally ill and Ms. Hartman was a predator grooming me online. He showed the desk sergeant a folder with 4 doctors' reports of persecution complex and false memory from childhood trauma. Inspector Diana Moretti examined the documents while Adrienne said, My parents wanted their sick daughter back for psychiatric care. Moretti noticed that the dates didn't match, and two of the signatures seemed identical, despite being from different doctors. Adrienne's cheerful face dropped when she said she needed to question us individually in separate rooms. My hands shook so much I couldn't hold the diary as I showed Moretti each page. She palled when she read about Officer Carl Reinhardt, who returned my cousin Emily Voss 3 times before she disappeared. Moretti put down the diary and called Carl to ask about 5-year-old payment records and typical families. She shouted before hanging up and told me her ex-partner had admitted to taking bribes to repatriate fugitive girls. She started an official investigation and told Adrienne he wasn't transporting me, while she notified state authorities about trafficking. Moretti had 2 cops take Adrienne away while she secured protective custody. The women's refuge had bars on the windows and a security officer who checked everyone in, but I couldn't sleep the first night. I clutched the journal closer with every hallway stride and read my grandmother's final entry. Trust no one. Always have an exit. Moretti returned the next morning with federal agent Elise Dubois, a cult deprogramming and human trafficking expert. Dubois had seen similar breeding operations in other states, but my grandmother's diary was more detailed. She photographed and submitted every page as proof, revealing how medical specialists and law enforcement controlled these networks across state lines. Dubois placed me with a verified foster family while they built their case against my parents. No one supervised me, had me memorize bloodlines, or measured my hips for breeding. Madame Keller showed me a bedroom with real windows and internal locks. I was enrolled under a protective identity and tried to focus on derivatives in calculus class, while the girl next to me whined about her parents not letting her go to a party. My family's breeding calendar predicted I would already be pregnant with my cousin's child, but no one here knew. Luca Meyer asked if I wanted to go to homecoming because he thought my life was normal. One afternoon, Julian stood across the street from school watching me walk to the bus. My security detail approached him, but he held a cardboard sign. Despite everything they'd done, part of me still doubted his fate. He knew exactly how to make me doubt everything. Agent Dubois brought recordings from my parents' phones obtained through the investigation warrant to the foster home that night. Dad was talking about retrieving their breeding stock, meaning me. And Adrienne was explaining the basement protocol for forced insemination. Ms. Hartman dyed her hair black and changed her style to help me. How did she know to conceal herself before picking me up? 3 days later, Dubois called me at the foster home to report the FBI raid results, which included sedatives, leather restraints, and breeding calendars for 12 girls in their network stored in my parents' basement. 3 pregnant teenagers said they were there freely, but Dubois saw Stockholm Syndrome in all of them. When they discovered how many families were involved in this breeding enterprise, the investigation expanded beyond my situation. I watched the news in the Kellers' living room as my parents protested religious persecution outside the courthouse. Mom lamented government overreach destroying European families, while Dad told reporters they were targeted for their traditional values. Several senators supported them on TV, calling it an attack on religious freedom and parental rights. I realized how powerful this network was when protesters outside the courthouse held signs supporting family rights and traditional marriage. 7 weeks after my escape, Mrs. Keller taught me how to cook normal dinners without genetic optimization rules. As we made spaghetti, I explained how every meal at home had exact protein ratios and fertility-boosting vitamins to enhance offspring production. Like a real mother, she listened without judgment and gave me seconds without calculating calories or asking about my reproductive health. Elena informed me through Dubois that she was preparing a case with 20 other network escapees to testify together. 2 girls recanted due to family pressure and another fled last week. Generations of wealth and legal ties gave the network's lawyers almost infinite power. My deposition was next month after the Keller's garage was spray-painted "Liar" and all the front windows were shattered. A note in the mailbox threatened worse if I testified against my family and their sacred customs. I couldn't let the Kellers suffer for wanting to foster me, so I begged Dubois for another placement. I met Sophie Lindholm, who had fled 6 years earlier and was hiding in a guarded location with other witnesses. Sophie showed me abdominal scars from her corrective treatment after rejecting her arranged marriage at 16. They tried to remove her ovaries to prevent bloodline contamination, but she escaped mid-surgery while bleeding. 2 months after my escape, I had insomnia and obsessively checked facility locks at night. I refused the therapist's anxiety medication because I remembered my parents' fertility supplements. I read Grandmother Beatrix's diary often, finding comfort in knowing someone else had survived and helped others escape. Adrienne was released from attempted kidnapping and conspiracy charges within hours using religious freedom funds. He appeared on TV in a clean suit and claimed he had tried to free me from indoctrinated sex traffickers. A supervised phone call at the Kellers made peculiar clicking sounds. According to financial data, Dubois found the breeding network had planted judges, police chiefs, doctors, and politicians in many states. The FBI learned that my calls were traced despite security safeguards, indicating someone in law enforcement was informing the families. I had 2 hours to collect my few items and say goodbye to Sophie. 3 weeks later, Dubois drove me to the federal courthouse in a bulletproof SUV with 2 other agents. Metal detectors at every entry and guards checking IDs twice made the building look like a concrete fortress. Dubois took me through the basement parking garage and up a special elevator, telling me Adrienne would be watching from the gallery. When we entered the courtroom and saw him in the 3rd row, wearing his nicest suit and staring at me, my hands started shaking. Adrienne's eyes followed me as the prosecutor led me to the witness stand to swear on a Bible to tell the truth. Adrienne shook his head when I told them about the sedatives he brought to make me cooperative. I described the genetic computations and ideal mating schedules that covered our dining room walls to the grand jury, who took notes silently. My voice trembled when I mentioned finding Grandmother Beatrix's diary and my aborted escape plan when I was caught. After 3 hours of testimony, Dubois led me back through the tunnels to avoid reporters. She said, "Julian was arrested this morning for trying to bribe a federal official with $600,000 for your location from an offshore account linked to dozens of genetic reservation families in 14 states. Federal authorities tracked every transaction and began hourly arrests." I shared my story with 3 other girls who had left similar families at the witness facility in the common area. Teresa Falk joked about making t-shirts that said, "I survived a breeding cult," making us laugh for the first time in months. After comparing medical exams and breeding patterns, we found our families used the same unlicensed doctors. Teresa fled to a homeless shelter when her family tried to breed her with her uncle at 16. Another girl showed us scars from her father branding her with the family crest to mark her as breeding property. We laughed at horrifying memories while eating microwave popcorn late at night. 4 months after my escape, Mom cried on a conservative talk show while showing my infant photos and telling the host the government had stolen her daughter. She wore her nicest church dress and dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The host called it a tragedy of government overreach against faith-based families. Counter-protesters surrounded the witness facility with my school photo on placards, demanding my return. The next morning, security deployed guards and cameras everywhere, but the crowd grew larger and angrier each day. Seeing freedom through bulletproof windows made the walls feel like another kind of jail. Dubois arrived that afternoon with paperwork linking my family to 6 unusual deaths over 40 years. 3 names from Grandmother Beatrix's notebook stood out, including a cousin who fell the week before her wedding. When examined together, the patterns were clear: similar injuries and illogical timing. Dubois warned me that having the FBI exhume bodies for new autopsies could put my family on alert. That night, a black car idled outside the facility for hours, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Security said they couldn't act unless someone left the vehicle or made a threat, but we knew who it was. Sophie was gently evacuated through the emergency exit into a waiting black SUV during a fire drill 2 days later. Security footage showed her glancing at the camera before entering, as if to suggest it was her choice. 2 days later, Sophie's family released a video of her sitting in her childhood bedroom, saying feminists had brainwashed her. She repeated every line with hollow eyes, like she'd been drugged. The prosecutor called an emergency meeting, warning that Sophie's return could destroy our case. 3 more witnesses refused to testify or return FBI calls after family contact. Defense counsel claimed the government was persecuting religious families for preserving tradition. All the news channels debated whether we were victims or liars, out to destroy our parents' reputations. 5 months after my escape, my parents uploaded my childhood medical records, including psychiatric evaluations, online. Adrienne called me a liar in court while I described the sedatives he'd used. Odd behavior for a righteous man. The evaluations labeled me unstable, prone to fantasy, and attention-seeking. But they didn't reveal that the doctors worked for the network. Within hours, #I Emily is lying trended as people dissected every word I'd said, trying to prove I was crazy. Strangers sent death threats to the FBI tip line, saying I deserved whatever my family had planned. 2 weeks later, Ms. Hartman, my old teacher, testified, and I watched from behind the prosecutor's table as she pulled out a thick folder of photos she'd taken since I was 14. She spread them across the evidence table, bruises on my arms from Mom's grip during lessons, and red marks on my neck from Adriana's grasp. The defense lawyer asked how she'd obtained those images and why she never reported them to child services if she was so concerned. Ms. Hartman said she had tried 3 times, but my parents always presented documents proving I was clumsy and injured myself. The lawyer brought up her 10-year-old DUI and implied she'd taken the photos for other reasons. After court, I met with a trauma psychotherapist who specialized in cult escapees. She said my constant door and window checking was normal for PTSD, and that she still jumped whenever someone knocked on her door 20 years after escaping her own religious group. The next morning, Elena testified via video link from a location the FBI wouldn't disclose for her safety. The defense objected nearly every 30 seconds to her statements and evidence, but she remained calm. She listed dates, names, and places where she'd helped 20 girls escape over 6 years. She presented screenshots, burner phone logs, and voice recordings she'd made over the years. The courtroom went silent when the prosecution played one of Elena's recordings. Adrienne's voice came through clearly. "What will happen when we get her back?" he said. Dad's voice followed, calm and clinical. "If she resists again, she'll be sedated until conception. Failed breeding stock can't be trusted loose." The jurors stared, speechless. 2 of them wiped their eyes as the judge called a recess. Even the defense team went pale. 3 days later, the trial resumed, under heavy federal security. Threats had been made against the court. Dead animals were found on jurors' porches, and 2 jurors requested dismissal, terrified for their families. The defense motioned for a mistrial, claiming the media had poisoned public opinion and made a fair verdict impossible. I watched everything I'd fought for start to crumble. 5 months after my escape, I sat at the Keller's kitchen table doing online coursework under witness protection. 2 FBI agents monitored the surveillance feeds from the living room as I tried to finish a constitutional essay about freedom. The irony hurt. My family had twisted that very word into a weapon, believing freedom meant the right to enslave their daughters under religion and bloodline. Julian contacted the prosecutor one morning, asking for a deal. He and his lawyer offered to reveal the full scope of the breeding program if granted protection. For 6 straight hours, he detailed operations in 45 states, describing genetic match databases families use to trade daughters like livestock for the best pairings. His testimony confirmed what investigators had suspected. There were hundreds of families just like ours. Julian described 3 corrective sessions he had personally witnessed: girls strapped to tables, injected with sedatives, and retrained to obey. The next day, Mom was arrested on conspiracy charges. She was released on house arrest with an ankle monitor, but her court photos showed her disheveled, with tangled hair and wrinkled designer clothes, so different from the elegant woman who once commanded every room. Elena called me that evening, sobbing. Sophie, the network girl who had escaped years ago, had been found dead in her apartment. The police called it suicide, but Elena knew better. Sophie had been scheduled to testify the following week about her family's breeding operation. I knew it too. That could have been either of us. I barely slept. When I finally did, nightmares replayed the sound of the syringe hitting the basement floor. Adrienne wasn't supposed to contact me, but I woke one morning to messages from a fake social media account. It was filled with photographs of me, walking to school, entering the courthouse, even sitting at the Keller kitchen table doing homework. The timestamps matched days when I was supposedly under full federal protection. The FBI went into chaos, searching for the leak. They found a tracking device stitched into the lining of my backpack. Someone had slipped it in weeks earlier. the investigation uncovered that certain agents were feeding location data to the network. One of them, Agent Victor Hahn, was caught sending encrypted messages to his wife, herself a member of a German breeding family. We had to move again. It was my 5th safe house in 6 months. Packing became muscle memory. Diary, documents, burner phone, toothbrush. I slept with my shoes on, just in case. Running and hiding was exhausting, but stopping meant dying. The morning we were scheduled to transfer me again, Julian called from an unrecognized number. His voice trembled. "Dad's dead," he said. "They said he hanged himself in his cell last night." My heart sank. Dad had agreed to cooperate with investigators for a reduced sentence. He was their key to the network's leadership. His suicide happened just 12 hours after the deal was finalized. He'd been under suicide watch. The guards claimed it was a lapse in supervision. No one believed it. The case split into 2 investigations, one for murder, one for corruption. When the prosecution lost Dad's testimony, the defense pounced. They hired false memory experts to argue that I'd fabricated trauma under outside influence. They said Elena and I had created a shared delusion, fueled by attention and hysteria. After hours of being accused of lying, I ran to the courthouse restroom and locked myself inside a stall. Dubois found me sitting on the tile floor, shaking. She sat down beside me, her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "They're pulling me off the case," she said quietly. "They threatened my family." Her voice cracked. "But we'll finish this, Emily, even if I can't stand beside you in court." The next week, Mom testified. She wore a black dress and pearls, the portrait of dignity. She cried softly and told the jury she'd done everything possible to help her troubled daughter. She produced medical records from clinics I'd never visited, therapy notes from sessions I'd never attended, and prescriptions for medications I'd never taken. She called me a victim of liberal brainwashing and a lost child corrupted by outsiders. The jury watched her dab at her eyes while she painted herself as a grieving widow, a mother who'd lost both husband and daughter. The deliberations lasted 3 days. Demonstrators gathered on the courthouse steps, split between calling me a hero and branding me a liar. I barely ate or slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Adrienne's smirk. On the second day, a juror received texted photos of her children at home, alongside a note that read, "Keep quiet or else." The next day, Julian was attacked in protective custody. 3 men beat him so severely, his spleen ruptured and his jaw had to be wired shut. Even in that state, he refused to recant. When I visited him in the hospital, his eyes were swollen shut, but he managed to squeeze my hand. "Don't let them win," he whispered through clenched teeth. Later that afternoon, I sat in another courthouse restroom, listening to 2 women gossip at the sinks. "Can you believe that girl's story?" one said. "No real family would do that." "My daughter lies like that too when she wants attention," the other replied. They laughed and left, their heels clacking down the hall. It hit me then how unbelievable the truth sounds to people who've never lived it. That evening, the jury returned. The foreman's hands trembled as he read the verdict. Adrienne was found guilty of attempted kidnapping, but not conspiracy. My mother was acquitted. The breeding network charges were dismissed for insufficient evidence. The room spun. Adrienne's sentence, 6 years, eligible for parole in 3, felt like a mockery. Mom smiled at me across the courtroom, the same smile she used to give before Sunday dinners. Julian's broken body was in a hospital bed, and Adrienne's lawyer was already talking about appeals. As reporters shouted questions, Dubois met me outside the courthouse. She pressed a small flash drive into my palm. "Keep this safe," she whispered. "If anything happens to me, use it." Then she turned and walked away without looking back. That night, I opened it. Every file was an FBI document, the hidden evidence Dubois had been collecting, emails between family patriarchs, records of bank transfers, even internal memos from complicit officers. There were charts pairing relatives for optimal genetics, spreadsheets detailing fertility yield rates, and doctor reports written in cold, scientific language. 3 days later, journalist Lemon Carver contacted me for confirmation about leaked documents she'd received anonymously. I knew it was Dubois. Within hours, the story exploded across every network. Survivors came forward. Reporters found marriage licenses between cousins, birth certificates with falsified fathers, and entire family trees built on coercion. 2 days later, Mom held a press conference outside the courthouse claiming religious persecution. She wore pearls and preached about ancestral duty while 4 teenage cousins stood behind her, the next generation. My stomach turned. That afternoon, a 60 Minutes reporter called, asking for an exclusive interview. Dubois warned me not to go public. It would make me a target, but hiding hadn't kept me safe either. I agreed. I spent the next week gathering proof. Grandmother Beatrix's diary, the doctor's fertility charts, Mom's correspondence, the forged therapy notes. 8 months after my escape, 60 Minutes turned my small apartment into a studio. Bright lights, microphones, cables everywhere. When the interview aired that Sunday night, 15 million people watched me hold up my grandmother's diary and read aloud, "They will kill you before they let you infect the lineage." The internet erupted. Some called me brave. Others called me a liar, a disgrace, a traitor to my bloodline. But the next morning, 3 congresswomen introduced the Breeding Network Accountability Act. The news called it Emily's Law. The day Emily's Law was introduced, I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by stacks of printed emails, family charts, and photographs. My phone vibrated non-stop. Reporters, survivors, strangers thanking me, and others calling me a liar. I ignored most of it. What mattered was that the truth was finally public. For the first time, the government acknowledged that forced genetic breeding networks existed. I wasn't a hysterical girl. I was evidence. Within a week, the FBI raided 14 more properties tied to the Voss and Fontaine families. They rescued 12 girls, the youngest only 13. I watched the footage on television. Terrified faces wrapped in blankets, escorted into vans, and felt my chest tighten. Their eyes looked like mine had that night I escaped through the bathroom window. The prosecution finally had enough evidence to charge Mom again, this time with conspiracy, child abuse, and trafficking minors for reproduction. After hearing about the disappearances of witnesses, the court denied her bail. When I saw her at the arraignment, she wore an orange jumpsuit, her hair tangled, her expression blank. Not the pristine matriarch who once dictated my every move. As more arrests followed, the network began collapsing. Families turned on one another, bargaining for lighter sentences. The unlicensed doctors, including Dr. Kruger, were taken into custody. Politicians who had shielded them faced public outrage and federal investigations. Julian was arrested too. He'd been transporting our younger cousins across state lines for breeding meetings. When I heard, I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness. Just the numb realization that blood didn't make anyone family. Within months, the investigation spread beyond the U.S. Similar genetic preservation societies were uncovered in Canada, Germany, and Austria. The FBI coordinated with Interpol, tracing money, documents, and even the language in family archives. Phrases about pure stock, founding lines, and selective continuation. Julian cooperated with federal agents, testifying against the network's leaders in exchange for witness protection. They relocated him to Northern Europe under a name I'll never know. Despite everything, part of me hoped he found some kind of peace. A month later, the lead prosecutor sent me a letter. He wrote that he was sorry. Sorry for being too cautious, too afraid to challenge powerful families sooner. "I let comfort win over conscience," he admitted. "You didn't." I kept that letter in my desk drawer for weeks before I could read it without shaking. 8 months after my escape, Congress passed Emily's Law, officially classifying coerced genetic breeding, arranged incestuous unions, and lineage-based reproductive control as federal felonies. The penalties were steep, up to life imprisonment. The day it passed, I stood in the White House Rose Garden beside 12 other survivors as the president signed it into law. My name, Emily Voss, though I went by Emily Morrow, was in the headlines worldwide. When reporters asked how it felt to change history, I said, "It feels like breathing clean air for the first time." That fall, I started college, majoring in social work. My roommate knew my story from the news, but never treated me differently. We pulled all-nighters, complained about professors, and shared cheap pizza at 2 a.m. For the first time, I felt almost normal. The nightmares came and went. Loud noises made me jump, and I still checked every lock twice. My therapist reminded me healing wasn't linear. You survived a system designed to erase you, she said. Of course it takes time to believe you're safe. 9 months after my escape, Mom's trial began. I attended every session. She took the stand in pearls again, claiming she'd been protecting our heritage. When the guilty verdict came after only 3 hours, she looked straight at me as the judge sentenced her to 27 years in federal prison. She didn't cry. She just stared, like she couldn't comprehend losing control. I looked back once, then lowered my eyes to my phone. She wasn't my mother anymore. After the trial, Elena and I founded the Beatrice Network, named after my grandmother. What she began in secret, we made real, a legal foundation helping girls escape forced marriages and trafficking under the guise of tradition. We built safe houses, hired trauma lawyers, and trained volunteers using FBI safety protocols. Our cards read, "Freedom is hereditary too." Therapy became part of my life. I sat in a soft green office twice a week, learning to separate safety from silence. Some days, I still checked every door 3 times or froze when a man stood too close. But other days, I laughed without fear. My therapist said, that's what healing looks like, uneven, but alive. One night, my emergency phone rang. A trembling voice whispered, "They're making me marry my uncle." It was a 15-year-old cousin from Germany. My heart stopped. I activated the network immediately. Within 3 days, she was in protective custody, and her parents were under investigation. Each rescue reminded me why I survived. The cycle was breaking, one girl at a time. That spring, I visited my grandmother, Beatrix's grave, for the first time. I brought fresh white flowers and her diary, the one that had saved my life. I sat on the cool grass and told her everything. About the law, the girls who escaped, the ones who didn't, and the legacy she'd started. Tracing her name on the gravestone, I whispered, "You were right." Writing it down was the first act of freedom. Every Thursday evening, I joined a survivor group in a church basement. We sat in a circle of folding chairs and shared stories, trembling voices becoming stronger each week. When new girls came in, eyes wide with the same haunted fear I once carried, I told them, "It gets better, not perfect, not easy, but better. You're free now, and that's everything." Sometimes they cried. I held their hands and remembered being 18, standing barefoot in the garden, running for my life. Mom still writes from prison, her letters full of scripture and delusion, insisting she was protecting our lineage. I don't respond. Some cages are made of belief, and she'll never leave hers. Now, at 20, I sit in my dorm room drinking coffee while my roommate jokes about our statistics professor looking like a startled owl. Students pass beneath my window, free, unburdened, ordinary. I am 20 years old, single, childless, and free, exactly what my family never wanted me to be. On my bookshelf, between textbooks and notebooks, rests my grandmother's diary, the one that started everything. It reminds me where I came from and why I'll keep fighting for every girl still trapped in breeding programs, disguised as faith, heritage, or honor. When another emergency call came in that evening, I didn't hesitate. I answered, steady and certain. "This is Emily," I said. "You're safe now. We'll get you out."